All right. Well, welcome, everybody. I'm so glad that so many of you have been able to join us, whatever time that you're in. I know that we are spread out all over the world, and I was reflecting this morning when Squid and I both jumped in with a pleasant time zones, everyone, that it's actually kind of funny how Radar has uniquely sort of adopted this very time inclusive greeting. And I really love that about us. We're here today to cap off a month of exploration that this community has been doing into the topic of time, thanks to a submission by Agalia, who is part of our panel today. And we've really just been asking ourselves, like, what constitutes a good use of time, and how do we sort of navigate that question as we seek to, embark on better futures, and how do we sort of reevaluate our relationship with time so that, it doesn't do us as much of a disservice as it seems to often do. And so we've got a wonderful panel here, including, like I mentioned, Agalia, who was the Campfire lead this month. We've also got Caitlin and Annie, who are our world building leads for this month. So really helping the community flesh out, like, what does the future, where we've redefined what time looks like, really bringing that to life. And then we've got some wonderful speakers. I do want to note, for those of you who were very excited to hear from Tamika Abaca Wood, unfortunately, she had some last minute travel. And so we do not have Tamika today, but in her place, we have the wonderful Martina, who's a Radar community member, but also has, thought long and hard about cathedral time as part of her work at WGSN. So we're thrilled to have that perspective here as well. And then we've got Michelle Laura, as we know, a friend of the community, and lots of startups around the concept of time. So we're excited to hear from her. And then we've got Professor Ruth Ogden, who studies time as her job. So we are thrilled about the panel that we've compiled today, and we're super excited to dig into some of the themes that have just seemed to hit people really hard throughout this month. So before we get into that, I do want to start with introductions. And as we do that, I want to talk about, for each person, tell us when and where in the world you are, and then just give us a bit about your relationship to time, both personally and professionally, or sort of either personally or professionally, whatever suits you. So why don't we start with Agalia, since you started this topic?
Hi, everyone. I'm Agalia. I am currently in Singapore, so it's 11 p.m. Slightly sleepy, so please forgive me if I ramble or something, but very happy to be here. In terms of my personal relationship with time, I think that since I was very young, I think I've just always been trying to chase time almost. It always feels like time is never enough. And, typical Asian culture, I've been made to study really hard since I was super young, and I think I've somewhat ingrained that hyper-productive culture within me, and it's always been instrumentalized based on the role that I want to play, whether it's a diligent student or someone who's ahead of the game. But right now, I really just want to flow and just keep this steady pace. And I've been thinking a lot about brunch. I think brunch is a great time. It's like where you don't look at the clock. You're just, enjoying, letting the morning blend into the afternoon. And I'm just searching for more of those moments.
I love that. All right, let's go to Annie.
Hi, everybody. I'm Annie. I am currently in Denver. The altitude is doing some funny things to my head, so I might sound a little froggy. I'm typically in upstate New York. So for me, my relationship to time is a little similar to, I feel like I'm always chasing time. And some of that is related to moving into an industry early in my career that I didn't feel like I belonged in. So it kind of ties to imposter syndrome. But I think on a more personal level, I experienced time blindness. And I think that I've slowly started to learn that there are ways that I can I can fix it, but at the same time, a lot of this time blindness that I experience, I found it also ties very closely to the things that really, really interest me. So that's a funny little tie that I'm trying to work out currently, ever since we started talking about time. But it's always been a struggle for me trying to catch up because professionally speaking, I've always felt like I needed to have everything entirely buttoned up to be taken seriously because of that sense that I didn't belong in tech because I didn't study in college, which I know now is not necessarily the appropriate mentality, but this is where it's led me. So I'm working through it, and I'm glad that we're having this conversation. Definitely.
Okay, let's pop over to Michelle, because that's who I see next.
Good morning from cloudy Portland, Oregon. It is 7 a.m. my time, so I apologize if I'm not my usual chipper self, but I'm so excited to be back. My relationship with time, I guess I will just preface, if any of you don't know, I was part of the amazing Future-thon that Radar put on last year, I want to say. And yeah, I can't believe it's been so long. My relationship with time is that I feel like I've always lived in a vortex where time does not exist. So I've always had a few challenges with just keeping up with time, and being a bit obsessed with timekeeping, which led me down a really strange rabbit hole of my professional career, to which now I am the founder of a lifestyle, really strange rabbit hole of my professional career, to which now I am the founder of a lifestyle brand called Siesta, where we are prioritizing our rest and relaxation in a world that's currently suffering from burnout. So I myself have gone through some pretty immense burnout. So Siesta is very much a passion project of mine. And I'm just so excited to be here talking to y'all about time. Yeah, I've been personally obsessed with time for most of my life. So I can nerd out on this topic any day, and I'm so excited to do that.
Awesome. How about Martina?
Hi, everyone. Hello from Milan. Here is afternoon. It's 4 o'clock noon, a cloudy day. And my relationship with time is a bit dual. I have a softer interaction with time, which is more driven by a sort of internal clock. I'm a sleeper. I very much enjoy expanded quiet time. I was born actually in 10 months because I was sleeping. So I thought there is something very much encoded into my internal DNA. And then I have a hard relationship with time, which is mainly driven by external factors like my job, societal push, and general limitations. I work for a very large global corporate, so of course we have like deadlines, KPI, key performance indicators. So we are tight in this kind of corporate structure that forces us to kind of passively accept these time definitions or time frameworks as part of our duties and tasks for my job. So very interesting for me exploring time throughout this past month. Because at first I became aware of this kind of dual interaction with time, but also I became more critical, and I'm starting to understand, okay, what's my position and how I can be better, and probably accept that we can live in a contrasting interaction with time, and this creates an interesting energy for us to reflect on it. And
I absolutely love the personal insight that you were born in 10 months and that has bled into your relationship with time. Caitlin, do you want to go? We're struggling to get off.
I got it. I reached it. Hey, everyone. I'm Caitlin. I am calling in from Toronto, Canada. It is 10:14 a.m. here. Yeah, so I'm the imagination director at Radar, which is amazing. And I'm also an executive creative director in advertising. So as you know, people have mentioned about the relationship your professional life can have on your sense of time. I certainly came up in that sort of like time is money culture. I spent almost a decade eating all my meals with my coworkers. And I definitely internalized like really deep sense of like productivity as self-worth. I mean, I'm definitely like a hyperactive person that's why I love Radar so much, because we have like rabbit hole friends who are like, I made a spreadsheet like for fun. but I think that's something that I've been reflecting a lot on. I think that happened for a lot of people in the sort of like pandy era time change, you know? And I also think that you know, I just parroted that sort of phrase, like time is money, somewhat sarcastically, but also like it was sort of the dominant for so long that I'm really grateful to the threads and sort of reflecting on that language and our metaphors and conceptions, because, you know, I think even if we think about time, for example, in like a, not that, but in like a barter economy, say, instead of how I spend my time, it's how I share my time, that really like shifts my relationship with it. And just one more thing I'll say, because I was thinking about it today in terms of relationship with time. Like I remember years ago reading research about the how time goes slower when you're a child and goes faster when you're older. And that being related to sort of the way everything is new when you're younger. And I think that definitely like informs the way that I like to say yes to life. And as much as I like routine, I like new adventures. So yeah, that's me.
Beautiful. And finally, Ruth.
Hi, thanks for having me on the discussion today. So I'm Ruth Ogden. I'm in Manchester in the United Kingdom. It's 3 o'clock-ish here and it's freezing cold. So it's not a particularly nice day. So I'm a professor of the psychology of time, and I spend my working life trying to understand how it is that all the things you're talking about affect our experience of time. So why is it that our emotions, our levels of stress, our levels of depression, our levels of anxiety, why do they affect our experience of time? Why does time slow down when we're in like near-death situations? So I look at it from the perspective of the individual, but then I also look at it from the perspective of society. So why is it that these huge changes that we see, you know, all the time within society, whether it's things like COVID or it's more gradual changes like the shift towards a digital world, or even, you know, tragedies, global health emergencies, disaster, diseases, why and how do these factors shape our experience of time as individuals, but also as collective groups? How do we become more linked with one another? And then one of the other things that I like to think about is how can we think about our sense of time to try and solve some of the problems that we're faced within the world today. So if we think about something like global warming, this is in many ways an issue of time. How do we get people to act more urgently or think in certain ways about time, change their behaviours quickly? So I look at time in the whole spectrum, but as a mum of 3 children, I just hear everything that everyone's saying about no time, time pressure, not enough time. There's never enough time, where is all the time? And I, you know, I'm desperate to try and learn from you guys about how I can maybe squeeze a bit more time out of my life.
Yeah, it's so interesting that pressure. I think that's what we've been exploring, right? That tension between the dominant culture of hyperproductivity and how can I squeeze as much time out of, you know, my life as possible, butting up against this like emerging desire to engage in these slower, softer ways of living. and like resolving that tension. And I think, you know, Michelle, in your work, I think you explore that, and Martina, you also brought it up in your sort of dueling perspectives of time. So I'd love to talk a little bit about that tension and what it means for you, and also just like how you've thought about resolving it. Maybe I'll throw it to Michelle, because I think the work that you do is sort of focused in that space.
Yeah, absolutely. So similar to most people, I grew up in New York City, so like I was just like kind of born into the rat race. So I've always had this ideation that like hustling and working super hard means productivity, means success. So I had like most of us have this like very skewed idea of what being a productive human being actually looks like. And my family is from the Dominican Republic. So in the Caribbean, you know, they're very much like go with the flow kind of people, what I like to call island life. They're on a different time. Like they definitely exist and have a different pace of life. So after like being part of both cultures, I had this like aha moment, especially with my own like discovery and journey of what burnout looks like. And just like one stat that I love to share is that 8 out of 10 people in North America are currently suffering from burnout. And I personally believe it's because of this like idea that at least here our society is teaching us since we're babies, since we're born, that we have to just continuously do. So throughout my own personal burnout journey, I realized that like I really needed to shift my thoughts on how I just like exist as a person. And it is still a challenge. Like I don't want to come across as like I've got it right. Like it's very much still a journey. Because it's like, you know, I now feel like I'm a fish out of water, because I am constantly up against like these cultural norms of like, oh, you need to have 3 side hustles to like be considered successful. To preface, I am a brand builder by nature. So I work with a lot of startups and I help a lot of people go from an idea to launching products or launching brands. So I'm in marketing as well. So that's kind of the life that I live. So like everybody's constantly thinking about doing like 14 things at the same time as like a flex. And I'm trying to like peel the onion back through my community siesta of like, let's do nothing. Let's try that. What does that look like? And how does that help? So yeah, paying an homage, going back to like my cultural roots, like taking a siesta, which is literally taking a break in the middle of the day. So very reminiscent on like, I believe somebody brought up brunch earlier. Like, yeah, like brunch culture is very much that concept of like splitting your day in half and just like taking a break to be able to kind of just like absorb what has happened in your morning and to be able to reflect on that for a better afternoon/evening. That's kind of how I've been forming my own day. But yeah, I feel like there are so many cultural, like other cultures have similar ways that they break up their day. And that's kind of what I've been on a journey of discovering. It's like, even just having that little shift, like how does that make us just be in our day to day? And I have found that it has made me much more productive, even though that is not the goal. But it just happens very naturally. So yeah, I'll leave it at that just in case anybody else wanted to like chime in.
Martina, I'm curious, you talked about reconciling those 2 perspectives of time that you have. I'm wondering if you've sort of come up with any strategies, or just sort of how you're sort of consciously trying to resolve that tension in your world.
Mm-hmm. Well, first, acceptance that I mean, of course, it's good to aim to find like a perfect relationship with time, but we live in a society, we live in a community, and everybody experiences time differently. And so we cannot kind of force like a universal perception and experience of time. So acceptance that it's important to follow your own internal clock and to embrace this, but at least I speak from my personal experience, it's impossible to impose and have this experience universally all of the time. So perhaps choosing, even during the part of the day, okay, I'm going to have like half of my day in which I'm going to follow my internal clock, and half of my day in which I'm going to just submit to the general or imposed framework of time and just develop my tasks or achieve the goals that I need to achieve because of my work. So first is the acceptance that perfection doesn't really exist, and we need to compromise, or at least I need to compromise and allocate time for myself and time for like a more imposed block. Let go. Acceptance is also understanding that I am like this. I am a slow person. Like I like to experience, analyze, study things critically, and this requires me to have a very expansive framework. And this means that I need to let go certain things. This means that certain tasks or certain ambitions I need to let go. And so perhaps in a day I can only achieve 2 or 3 tasks, and maybe somebody more proactive can achieve 10, and I can only achieve 3 or 4, and be content and satisfied with this. So I think for me the goal is acceptance and compromise and letting go, and always like be critical when you're trying to achieve like the best you can, but also being aware of who you are and yeah.
I had some sirens going on, and that is why I was fancy muted me. But here we are. We're back. There's no more sirens. And I wanted to get into this a little bit because it's come up now a couple times, which is this tension between the shared social understanding of time. You brought it up in your sort of intro, Ruth. And then also this acceptance of the personal, the nuanced, like the individual perspective, whether, you're coming at it from, we've been exploring a lot of like the neurodivergent perception of time is wildly different from the neurotypical perception of time. Cultural perceptions of time are wildly different from one another. Your internal clocks are different, for a variety of reasons. And I think it's so interesting to think about what, how do you embrace an individual nuanced perception of time while still striving for, the importance of a shared understanding, right? Like shared markers of time are really important for cultural synchrony. And Ruth, I'd be curious, since you've researched like both sides of that, how do you see those two things reconciling, or are they just constantly at odds?
I think it's a really fantastic question. And I think if we think back in time, let's say, to points where people didn't have their own watches. So society was sort of all geared around everyone getting up and doing the same things at the same time. So women would be cooking at the same time, men would be going out to do whatever they did at the same time. You have this sort of close relationship between everybody's activities. So we have this really strong societal rhythm. And I think if we think about what society's like now, that very strong societal rhythm is probably absent for a very large number of people, particularly since COVID and the change in work patterns that we've had. So we're no longer going to the office all the time, very much working from home, typically working in big global corporations where you might be working in the morning, the evening, or at night. So I think the idea of a societal time is becoming a little bit more like a global time for many people, particularly in the global north. And I think that this is always at odds with who we are as individuals. So we know things like women are more time pressured than men. People who have lower levels of education or lower financial resources are more time pressured than people with greater resources. So I think that what we see in time and people's experiences of time is that normal pressures within society exert similar pressures on people's experience of time. So if you're disadvantaged economically, you tend to be disadvantaged in time. If you're disadvantaged socially, you tend to be disadvantaged in time. And this can play out in lots and lots of different ways. So one of the things that I think is particularly interesting is if when we start to think about endings and the endings of different events in our lives or in our societies. So if we take COVID for an example, for me, COVID felt like super long, super stressful, super isolating, hated every minute of it. So it was a really long, drawn out experience, and then it ended. But it felt afterwards like it lasted for a really long time. And we saw this in our research for lots and lots of people. For some people, it's still not over. So we've got something that's in the past for me. People with long COVID, it's still in the present. People with long-term health conditions, it's still in the present. So I think the way in which we think about time is individualized, but we have to wedge it into this really difficult, complex societal organization. And one, just coming back to something that Michelle said before that I thought was fascinating about siesta, is this idea of what is doing nothing now? Like, can you even imagine a time in your life where you do nothing? I can't. Like, I'm always like doing a bit of doom scrolling, or like I feel like if I'm doing nothing, I'm wasting time. And why do I feel like this? Where have I got this idea from? And how do why does society tell me this is what I need to do as an individual? And I think these are the key questions. If we want a healthy relationship with time, we really need to think about why we feel the need to fill it and how we can stop doing that as a society, as individuals.
Absolutely. And I think that leads us beautifully into the metaphor conversation, right? Because if we think about time as something to waste, time as something to I'm grabbing time, I'm putting time on, I'm, spending time, time is money. You think of time as the way that we conceptualize time in the Western world is physical. It's limited, it's monetary, it's like discrete and defined. And I think we've been having some really interesting conversations in the community. So I'd love for, Annie, Caitlin, Agalia to jump in and talk a little bit about giving time back. That's the absolute worst of them. Talk a little bit about this idea of language and the metaphors that we use around time and what might happen if we allow ourselves to think about alternative metaphors for time, or freeing ourselves from that sort of like physicality of language. Caitlin, you are muted if you're trying to.
Gesturing to my peers.
I guess I can start. I always keep thinking about like the default, and like just going back to the calendar example, like the calendar grid starts off empty, and it's always that it's almost like the objective is to fill it up with as much as you can. And at work, it's also quite interesting to hear that sometimes people will almost see you blocking your calendar. For example, like if you block like just saying like busy or like do not disturb, they'll be like, oh, like why are you blocking your time? They almost see it as something self-indulgent, and they're like, oh, you should be accessible during your working hours. But they don't quite get that, like the personal time is so important. So going back to that conversation we had on Discord, it was like, what if you change that default? What if the calendar grid was full and you're actually taking time away? So that would also then change that metaphor. Yeah.
So I'm just going to jump in. Since this whole month of time discussion started, I've actually stopped telling people at the end of meetings, I'm going to give you 10 minutes back, or, whatever we all say, because I'm consciously trying to change the way I speak about time and the way that I relate to time because of all of the realizations that I've had. And I loved what Michelle said about having the time to reflect. So I think that somewhere along the way, we all collectively decided that resting is not okay. It's not something that we can put in our calendar. Reflection is not something we put in our calendar. Taking the time to read. I mean, I work in product, and the majority of my time is research. But I always feel this weird guilt when it comes to scheduling time in my calendar. So going back to what Agalia was saying, when I put time in my calendar to block for, research or investigating a certain thing, there's something in my brain that says you're not actually writing anything. You're not, writing an email. It's interesting how that happens to my brain. So I'm actively trying to remove myself from that thought process. And I've been talking about it with so many people ever since. And last night I spoke with somebody who, not super recently, but recently enough, was in an accident that left her off work for 6 months. And she didn't know what to do because she wasn't able to watch, TV. She wasn't able to read. And it was, for her, she said the words, "How do I rest productively?" And that just blew my mind, because on my first instinct was to say, why would you? Oh yeah, I would probably do the same thing. I would have that same thought process. And I think going back to that kind of reflection time, if we could repurpose the way that we think about reflection, research, just thinking and taking that time to relax, I think that that's, something major that I wish we could figure out a way to pull that into our vocabulary versus saying, steal some time to think or steal some time to rest, So that's what I've been noodling on.
Yeah. It's like there's so much value in boredom, actually, and people can't
Yes.
wrestle with that. What I think is interesting, though, about all of this is okay, clocks and calendars are relatively new inventions, right? So, when you think about indigenous perspectives on time, going back to even just alternative cultural perspectives on time, where, we're more in touch with natural rhythms, we're more in touch with, the seasons or the sun rather than the clock, that completely changes our ability to think differently about how we work and how we spend time and how we do these different things. So I know, Michelle, you natural calendar comes to mind. So I'd love to hear you talk about that a little bit. And then Ruth, I'm curious, just in your research, these alternative sort of indigenous perspectives on time, does that come up for you at all? And how might we learn from those cultures and think about, not having a Western hegemony rule forever?
Yeah, I love every moment I had when researching with the team, when we were coming up with the idea and concepting the natural calendar. So for context, we were thinking about, what we can do to create a better future in true radar form. And then this exact topic came up over and over again during the Future-thon. So many of us were just okay, we are completely out of sync with ourselves simply just because of the way that we have to constantly follow a calendar system like the Gregorian calendar that was imposed upon us for X, Y, and Z reasons, usually religious factors. But why are we all syncing on this weird pattern? So that is kind of how the natural calendar concept came to be, where we wanted to get back in touch with our own natural rhythms. So first, let's look within. And the natural calendar concept was to first align yourself with how you normally function. So the best example of that was my favorite was, many of us pretend to be morning people because of productivity. But maybe that's just not the case for some of us. It's not natural. That's not what your internal cycles want to do. So you're actually putting yourself out of sync from the beginning of the day just because you're pretending to be a morning person because for some reason society said that's what productivity should be. So even just that one example makes you really just shift your way of oh, maybe I should not book meetings before 10 a.m. my time, simply because that's not what my natural rhythm wants to do. So the natural calendar is all about like making sure that you're planning your day in accordance with your own personal rhythm, but then also learning how your personal rhythms get affected by natural rhythms. So menstrual cycles to lunar cycles, solar cycles even. So yeah, it is such a fun way of just thinking about your personal, like everybody's, it forces the person to think about their personal relationship with time and then their relationship with nature. And it was so fascinating. And I actually still to this day try to align myself in that way where I just am constantly absorbing and learning things about myself according to like what's happening in the natural cycles of things. So yeah, that's my favorite example to give, is that like I no longer pretend to be a morning person, even though today I am for all of you. But I naturally am not, and that's okay. And I don't shame myself for it any longer.
Yeah, we all love that. There was a quote, like, why are you trying to summer? It's winter. Like, you know, like it's not natural. Yeah, Ruth, I'd love to hear your perspective on sort of what we can learn from.
I mean, I think the idea of a natural calendar is just fascinating, and I really love your take on time, Michelle. I think it's super inspiring to think of the ways that we can have a more nuanced and more personal relationship with time that's gentler and softer, and how that might be super beneficial for everybody. I mean, in terms of cross-cultural differences in time, for me, it's such a fascinating area. So, as you say, in the global north, Western hemisphere, we have this very typically linear relationship with time. We see the past and the present and the future as a line. And in fact, if I had a room full of people now, I could get you to do a little sort of experiment where you close your eyes and you have to point to where you think the future is. And if you grew up in the northwestern hemisphere, you'll point towards the right, and you can point to where the past is, you'll point towards the left. And this is because we have these very linear timelines in our head. And what's obviously fascinating is when we go to different places in the world and we try and understand how different people start to think about time. So you can think of this South American group called the Amara, who have a very reversed sense of time in comparison with us. So they would see the past as in front of them and the future as behind them. Similarly with Maori in New Zealand, so you walk backwards into the future, keeping your eyes on the past because you're learning from the past. So the past is what we know, so we see it. The future is what we don't know, so it's behind us. And I think this, like, these are really interesting, like they're intrinsically interesting ways of thinking about time, but I think they also have super benefits for us to think about ways in which we can think about time on an individual or on a personal level. So the whole idea that we're talking about of hustle culture, of time being productive, is because we have our focus on the future. We're always trying to reach this next goal, which is just a little bit further away or just a little bit higher up. And what we're not really doing is being in the present as much as we probably could. And we're certainly not spending time thinking about the past as much as we could. And we see that as an individual, but I think we also see it, if we think about political movements, it's future focused. Everything is about meeting the next goal, and the next goal is really soon, and we don't.
Did everyone lose Ruth? Oh no.
But instead, we're trying to harmonize or bring together the past and future.
Yeah, we lost you for a bit in there, but I think, what you say about like not having the idea that we don't have sort of a cultural memory, a societal memory is such a problematic thing, especially when you think about half the world being in an election year right now. So I do want to move us into Q&A since I went a little bit over in the panel chat. So I would love people jump in a queue with questions. Has anybody, Fancy, if you're monitoring, has anybody dropped any questions in the chat? And if not, just throw yourself in the queue. There's a little button over here with I have a question, and we'll let you come off mic and drop your question in. Anybody? Well, in the meantime, I'll ask another question. Okay, I'll just ask another question. One of the other things I wanted to talk about, which actually we just sort of got into, was the cultural gravitation toward the eternal present, and what it means, what it would mean for us to get back in touch with this concept of timefulness, right? Like this, everything is full of time. We are all products of our pasts. Every object, every, natural habitat is a product of its past. And timelessness is actually like a falsehood, right? We live in this eternal present. We don't think about the past. We don't think about the long future, thinking about, climate change. So Martina, I wanted you to talk a little bit about cathedral thinking. I think this is the perfect opportunity to think about that a little bit.
Definitely. Very interesting for me also, because I operate in the futures industry. So we always think about the future, and it's a bit of a broken system, because I always feel that if you want to project your thoughts in the future, you need to look at the present, and you need to look at the past and connect and create an history, a narrative that's super important. But in our industry, we have this obsession for the future, for the innovation, and looking forward, and we don't realize that actually the future is an object of the present and of the past. So I think that's very important. Cathedral thinking is a very interesting concept. So to define it a bit, so we are all on the same page, this is a bit of a Western perspective, because it's a principle that existed also in indigenous communities as the 7th generation thinking. So cathedral thinking is inspired to like a medieval approach to construction, when kings or the church was building like a building, for example, a church, a palace, a monument. And the way the team, the constructor, the builders, everybody would work about it is to project in the future. So plan for 100, 200, 300 years in the future. So it really challenged, opposite to what we just talked about, it really challenged the idea of like short-termism and look at long-termism. So when this team was starting to plan and construct these buildings, these projects, they will think at the implication of this element, this building, in 100 or 200 or 300 years in the future. And they will build resilience to face potential future challenges or implications in the future. For example, next to a church, they will plant a forest. So in 100 years or 200 years, when restoration work needed to be done, they will have trees, they will have like wood to be able to restore the church. So this idea of like long-term means, which doesn't mean thinking only about the future, but also think about the past and the present, but also prepare for the future and think about potential challenges, implications in the future of what we are doing now. So that's a bit in a nutshell cathedral thinking. And in the report I developed, I analyzed how this way of thinking is almost completely absent in business, especially in like product and design development, and how thinking like this enables a company, a designer, a creative to really expand their thinking and implement the needs of the wider society, including the society of the future, in what they are producing, designing, ideating now.
Yeah. One of the things I think a lot about in selling futures work to clients is that they're so often rotated off a piece of business, or they're rotated into a new role, and so they don't care about the future. The long term is not their concern, and it's so interesting. In that context, it's unfortunate. But when you think about a context like, to bring it back to climate change that Ruth brought up, you need to create urgency, but you also need to create a view of the long term, and that you need to be able to connect the urgency to the long term. And I think that is such a difficult thing for people. It's such a foreign concept for so many people to be able to think about, the world when you're gone. Because that's what those builders and kings and people were doing. They were building a church for a world that they didn't exist in. So I think that's such an interesting problem to face. and I don't know, Ruth, if you've done any specific research in regards to that climate change sort of piece of it.
So I think what's super interesting about the climate change example is that we sort of have this competing narratives of time. So one is that this is an emergency, okay? It's an emergency, it's a crisis. But you could say, well, how long can something be an emergency? How long can something be a crisis? We're talking, obviously, for some people, the effects of climate change are now and they're present and they're already in their past, but for many people, they're in the future. So how do we think really carefully, I think, about the language that we use in relation to climate change to make sure that we don't undermine arguments of urgency and undermine arguments of crisis by implying that something is now, or it's imminent, or it's just around the corner, when for some people it might be further down the line. So I think we have to be very careful about the types of language we use. And one of the ways in which we can try and do that is to try and make people aware of the circumstances that are changing in their own environment. So I think so much of the climate narrative is based on talking about places which are often very far away as an imagined future for us, or a potential future for us. And what we actually need to be thinking about, well, what are the natural changes in our own ecology? What are the things that you're noticing in your own life? So how do we bring these really big timescales into people's own day-to-day existence? Because if we can do that, then we're much more likely to be able to motivate people to make the small changes that they need. If we constantly talk to people about very distant potential outcomes, I think that the point that you made about you're asking people to imagine a world beyond their lifespan, for most people, this is not only is it super hard, but it's not something we want to do. Like, I don't want to think about the world beyond my death. Like, that means I'm not here. It's really difficult. So we need to try and bring maybe some of the arguments into our own lived experience now to make people more motivated, to make people more engaged.
Absolutely. Caitlin, do you have a question?
No, I will. Well, I just wanted to add on this because I think, we've seen in a number of signals, like across not just time, but this like longing to more natural relationships with each other, with the world. And, it's interesting the way when we think about like the natural calendar and what that does to our connection with like ideas of productivity, or how we run business, or like what goal success looks like, or whatever. Like, I think it's really interesting, that piece of connecting natural time to that. And what it reminded me of, Ruth, when you were talking about that relationship to climate emergency, is I remember years ago reading this statistic about like, if children under the age of, I'm making it up, like under 6 spend a certain percentage of time in nature, they're significantly more likely to be like engaged in like environment and like have a healthier relationship with like climate stuff. So that to me is really interesting, because it's like, if we're all moving towards more natural, then there's sort of perhaps this cascade effect with like how we have a relationship with time. I was just going to add too, I'm so grateful you all reminded me of like talking about these examples. And I think it's so interesting the way we're all like, the clock, like the clock is the worst part, And I'd forgotten that when I was 15 years old, so I did a lot of canoe tripping as a teenager. And when I was 15, I did a 36-day canoe trip with like a group of other girls my age. And there were several things we weren't allowed to bring on the trip. Mirrors was one, but clocks was another one. And we were not allowed to bring watches. And I remember that our relationship with our days, with each other, it was like, I learned how I can tell the time with my hands. We would eat when we were hungry, and it really just had a different spaciousness, So I think it's just really exciting that we're here having these conversations. It makes me feel optimistic.
I love that so much. It makes me think also what you said, about kids and nature affecting their sort of long-term relationship with nature. kids in time, reflecting their long-term relationship with time. Maybe the change to effect is actually, what does time look like in schools? What does sort of, we've done a lot of thinking about the future of education and alternative schooling models, and maybe it's affecting change in that setting can actually affect broader change, overall. I think that could be a really interesting exploration that is not something that I think we've talked about at all as a community. So that's a fun stumble upon. Does anybody have any thoughts about that? We just like it.
No, I mean, I think it's fascinating. I think if you think about, the British schooling system, I think is largely similar to the American one. It's all about time-orientated goals. Like, you do this for a year, and it doesn't matter whether you learn the things you needed to at the pace you needed to. You do it at the pace that we tell you to. And, if you graduate high school late, then you're a failure. And if you don't meet this target and that target, like it's ingrained from kindergarten and from primary school that life's a ladder, and you climb the ladder at the set pace, and the person who gets to the top the quickest is the winner. And how do we then, as adults, pull that back? How do we unlearn all of that learning? It's an impossible task. So I think you're absolutely right. The idea that we would have a much more sensitive relationship with time during education, but both within the structure of individual days, but particularly over the lifespan of the educational system, where taking more time is not a failure. Taking more time is seen as just something that you can do if you want to do, and that's absolutely fine. And how do we navigate that sort of system, which would ultimately, for society, be better for everybody? More people graduate college, even if it takes them longer. That's better. It's a good outcome economically and intellectually.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's everything from the school bell and the urgency that creates, and the time that you spend, and the guilt around skipping a semester or skipping a year, or not being held back a year. It does all come back to language. I think somebody just brought that up in the chat. Like, I was held back a year. Like that language is hurtful. It's not empowering in any way, which is really something that's really interesting. Caitlin can confirm that Jarvis is, how old is Jarvis? 7, 8?
8.
He's 8 years old, and there is never enough time for snacks.
Yeah, it's just always it seems to be at odds with his natural, just I don't know. School, we learned, is designed by the same people who make prisons, and he's just trapped at a desk. It's I don't know. I wish I could liberate him. I just can't figure out how to do it.
Moshner, I love that. I was held back a year I get another year of childhood. It's just an interesting perspective. You're not always trying. You're as a kid, you're taught to chase adulthood in the same way that we're all chasing time. And how do you make it not something that you're chasing, but rather, to Caitlin's point, this spaciousness that you get to live in and exist in and use how you sort of see fit. Well, I think that's a beautiful note to end on, unless anyone has does anyone on the panel have a final thought that they want to get out? Something burning that we love? No? Yes? Michelle?
Yeah, 2 things. 2 things. I love the fact that somebody just said, it's a great experiment to not have clocks in your room. I've been doing it for a while. Highly recommend. I kind of take it to another level where, I know our phones have clocks and our cars have clocks, but I even just block it out. I feel like that's a great action or task, if you're willing to participate, to do and see what that does to you. And then another point I wanted to bring up was just your relationship with nature. I dropped it in the chat, but if you've ever happened to see a farmer's almanac, I highly recommend just glancing through it, because it really puts natural cycles into perspective, where you have certain windows of time for certain tasks, like planting certain flowers, even like, it's funny, like even getting a haircut, you know, there's like certain tasks that the Farmer's Almanac tells you to do according to this window of time. And it really helped me like put time into a new perspective. So those are the two things I wanted to share as like actions to take away from today.
All right. Well, we're just at time. Thank you guys so much for joining us. For those of you who joined from outside the community, you're always welcome to apply and join us inside of Radar. We're probably still going to be talking about time for quite some time, and we're going to kick off our next campfire on the future of stuff starting next week. And we're just so excited to have you here, and hopefully this makes its way onto a podcast feed sometime soon, once I figure out how to edit a podcast and make one. So we'll get there. Well, thanks everybody. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.